Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I do hope you're doing remarkably well, and I hope that you're ready to listen to a lovely story tonight because I've got a fabulous one for you. So before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, I have lived in the Bluegrass State most of my life. In truth, I could never imagine living anywhere else in the entire world. After I got married to my husband Josh, I wanted to buy a farm that wasn't too far away from my parents' farmhouse. As I come from a very close-knit family, it made perfect sense to live a hair's breadth away from each other. Me and my husband Josh struck it gold when a farmhouse I had adored as a girl came onto the market. I had dreamt of living at Highlands Peak as a grown-up, but I never believed the property would ever be put up for sale. The illustrious farmhouse had belonged to the Tea Leaf family for over 3 generations, but they finally decided to sell up and move away to Ontario in Canada. When I learnt it was on the market and up for sale, I snapped it up straight away, assuring the estate agent I would take it, thank you very much. The property was an absolute steal, and I soon found out why. The previous owners, the Tea Trees, had allowed the distinguished farmhouse to go to rack and ruin, which was nonsensical, as the family were incredibly wealthy. Dorothy Tea Leaf was a miserly woman who cut out every coupon available, entering any competition going, in order to get something for nothing. She would win loo rolls to last an entire lifetime, and all kinds of useless trivia that took up so much space, and really had no earthly use whatsoever. But as long as it was free, Mrs. Tea Leaf thought she had hit the jackpot, and would stash her winnings away in her storeroom, to gather a plethora of dust. The cheapskate woman who guarded her money like a squirrel its stash of acorns for the winter, always bought her daughter second-hand clothes from thrift stores, when in reality she could easily afford to buy Amanda an enviable wardrobe of high-quality clothes. In the end, it would seem the foolish, short-sighted, penny-pinching woman had paid a remarkably high price for refusing to maintain the upkeep of their home. It would seem she couldn't bear to spend a single penny on its general maintenance, regarding such sagacious investment as extravagantly frivolous. I knew that former generations in her family line would naturally be turning in their graves to see what her wilful negligence had done to their superb family home. It was one thing if she couldn't afford the upkeep, but quite another when you arrogantly abandoned your responsibilities so that you could watch the funds in your bank gain more zeros, while everything else in your life fell apart and crumbled into oblivion. Mrs. Tea Leaf's family members resented how her tight purse strings had created a huge wedge in their lives, like an island in the Pacific separated from the mainland. Regretfully, Mr. Tea Leaf, Amanda's father, couldn't bear his wife's stinginess a moment longer, soon filing for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences as the reason for finally leaving his wife. "I hate my mother," Amanda Tea Leaf used to say to me. "She's got lots and lots of money, but she buys me second-hand clothes and used gifts for Christmas that other kids once enjoyed. My mum is really mean. She doesn't like to spend any of her money. She just likes to watch it grow, like a tree that produces way too much fruit that nobody bothers to eat. That's why my dad left. He couldn't stand my mum's stinginess a moment longer. Mum never let him have anything nice." I had felt so sorry for Amanda, having a mother who always bought her groceries with the marked-down prices you get before the item eventually expires, so the once fresh muffins are all dried up and stale, and the old milk you brought is about to turn. Let's just say Mrs. Tea Leaf parted with every penny she spent with the same kind of reluctance of Scrooge in the Christmas Carol. The two of them would have made a fine, compatible, joyless pair. Me and Amanda had been best friends since we were about 13, until we changed schools and drifted apart. But even after all those long years, I remember the special times I spent with Amanda Tea Tree with a great deal of fondness. Now that Amanda Tea Tree and her mother had moved to Canada, I doubted we'd ever cross paths again. In truth, I found that thought quite sad. I remember that the Tea Tree farmhouse was such a classical building, the type of house that never ever slips out of vogue, as stylish houses like this are just so traditional. They don't lose their illustrious allure, no matter how many generations have gone steamrolling by. Ostensibly this gorgeous house, with its leaking roof, had allowed all the glorious parquet floors, staircases and ceilings to rot and disintegrate, and the paint on the outside wall was peeling badly, like overburnt skin that peels away after prolonged sun exposure. Even the outside outbuildings appeared to be crumbling and falling apart.
"This is what happens when you don't maintain a property,"
the estate agent Dennis Harper had told me, looking lugubriously sorrowful.
"I'm afraid Mrs. Tealeaf refused to invest any of her money in the property. Now she is having to sell at a monumental loss. She's very affronted by this, of course. Does not seem to appreciate the concept that sometimes you have to spend money in order to make money. This place would be going for a sizable fortune if it had remained in prime condition. But it appears Mrs. Tealeaf was not as savvy as she appears to think she was."
I was naturally devastated to see the charming house that I'd held in wondrous awe as a young girl, looking so desolate, so unloved and rejected. It was like an old, much-loved friend that I'd always held in such high regard. Pitiful tears glistened in my eyes as I stared in horror at its decrepit, forlorn state. It was so unfortunate that it had been exposed to so much abysmal neglect. In truth, if it had been in pristine condition, I would never have been able to afford the place. So the grey cloud did indeed have a silver lining after all. Let's just say most wise, well-learned people couldn't be bothered to put that kind of pressure on themselves in order to refurbish a property, restoring it back to its former glory, which would naturally involve blood, sweat and tears. I had a brother Chuck who was an excellent building contractor, who could do the job for me at a very affordable price. I wasn't about to stare a gift horse in the mouth. The old forsaken house that still held its head high above its ruins cried out to my heart in a tiny little timorous voice, "Please help me," and I couldn't ignore its pleading cries to be rescued. It was beleaguered, a shadow of its former self, of what it had once been. But I knew the place had excellent bones and fabulous potential, so despite its appalling appearance, I had great faith that Highlands Peak would once rise again, like a phoenix from the ashes. It had taken a year of anguish, fortuitous challenges to bring the place back to its once perfect, pristine condition. But it was restored, and I knew that despite the horrendous back-breaking workload to bring it finally back to its feet, it had been worth all the trouble, all the heartache. The grandiose classical mansion stood proud, lofty and tall, no longer ashamed of her sorry state, like a woman who once owned sagging skin and hollow cheekbones, who receives a facelift and steadily regains her self-esteem and former confidence. The house twinkled and sparkled as it stood there, luxuriating decadently under the soft golden light of the morning sun, nestling in a pretty viridescent valley. It boasted brand new additional stable blocks and outbuildings which were in tip-top condition, and would have been the envy of any aspiring horse owner. If that wasn't enough, the land stretched back for many miles like a sizable happy yawn, where lofty trees hugged the woodgroves in a neat, decent spaced congregation of satisfactory green giants that many would be proud to own. The rolling countryside smiled back at me warmly under a cobalt blue sky that at the end of a long day, much like a woman adorning a fabulous evening gown, miraculously transforms itself into a bedazzling watercolour of pinks, yellows, golds and tangerines as the sun finally begins to set. And believe me, some of our sunsets in the Bluegrass State are very beguiling indeed. 15 years later, it was a beautiful crisp summer's morning when a large white Land Rover pulled up outside my stable block. I knew that this was a woman called Mrs. Penrose, whom had eagerly booked her 8-year-old child for a riding lesson with me. I often recruited people for my lessons from word-of-mouth recommendations, and Mrs. Penrose, formerly from Canada, had learnt about my skills as a teacher. I had been told she had settled in a property not too far away from where we lived, and had a young girl called Emma, who was very eager to learn how to horse ride. I observed a haughty, somewhat smug-looking woman, who wore an aura of self-entitlement like a chain around her neck, from a safe distance. I assumed this must be Mrs. Penrose, with her peroxide, very highlighted blonde hair, and expensive Gucci sunglasses. She climbed out of the truck, with the kind of elegant poise you would expect to see in a duchess. She was wearing hip, fashionable designer jeans, boasting snazzy diamante designs, ornate-looking red cowgirl boots, and, dare I say it, there was a bit of a swagger to her walk, almost as if she was saying, "I know I'm all that," like a peacock flashing its dazzling feathers at a dowdy pea-hen, who must feel as grey and bleak, like an overcast morning by contrast. In the faint shadow of this stylish woman's resplendent ensemble, I will not deny I felt a wee bit intimidated, suddenly painfully aware of just how scruffy I was by contrast to this beguiling showstopper. Now I knew exactly how a peahen felt, being overshadowed by the dazzling male superstar. For God's sake, I told myself, you're a riding teacher. You're not supposed to look like you're about to grace the red carpet in Hollywood. People on farms wear practical, sensible clothes. There was nothing remotely practical or sensible about Mrs. Penrose. She threw sensible out of her truck window, like a chewed-up apple core, and wore impracticality on her person with a self-congratulatory pride, like an exclusive designer bag. There was no denying that she was a striking woman, but the trouble was her vaingloriousness was very conspicuous, and I'd never been particularly partial to people in love with their own reflection. If she was standing over a lake of water, she'd get so caught up in how great she thought she looked that she'd easily fall in. That was my thinking anyway. She moved towards me with her daughter by her side, with the grace of a ballerina. At close inspection I could see a vast fortune had been spent on her appearance, with no expense spared. The woman's forehead did not move an inch. She had been Botoxed within an inch of her life, and any wrinkle that dared to make an appearance had been arrested and handcuffed by the power of an artificial snake poison that promised to hold back time without apology. The 8-year-old girl was kitted out like a professional rider, wearing brand-new jodhpurs and a riding hat, and they moved towards me with wide-open grins on their faces. For a brief moment I was struck by what I can only describe as a fleeting sense of déjà vu. Something about this glamorous woman looked strangely familiar, but I just could not place her, and in that moment it really niggled me. Where did I know her from, I wondered. I've seen her round before. Try as I might to put the incongruous pieces together in my head, like the odd angles of a peculiar jigsaw puzzle. No answers were forthcoming, and I was at a blank as to who she was. Maybe I'd seen her doppelganger around, I thought. That must be it. The mysterious woman was from Canada. I was not personally acquainted with anyone that lived in that part of the world. "You must be Mrs. Penrose," I said, stretching out my hand to shake hers in mine. She took my hand in her perfectly manicured one, giving it a tight, friendly squeeze. "This must be your daughter Emma. Nice to meet you, Emma," I said. "Welcome to Highlands Peak, and of course to your first riding lesson. You and me, we're going to have lots of fun today, learning to ride horses. It's a blast, I promise you. You're going to thoroughly enjoy yourself." The young girl said nothing, but I didn't get the impression she was remotely reticent, only indifferent towards me. Mrs. Penrose, sensing her daughter's lack of decorum and poor manners, answered on her behalf, trying to iron away her daughter's insolence. "That's right. This is my daughter Emma. She's your pupil today. She's very excited about learning to ride horses, aren't you, darling?" Then she said something that set the cat among the pigeons for me, as far as I was concerned. "It's so good to see you again, Margot." I stared at the woman nonplussed. How on earth did she know me? Not many people had ever called me Margot. Only those who knew me intimately and very closely. To the rest of the world I was known as Marjorie. "Honestly, Margot," said the woman, pulling off her Gucci sunglasses to have a close-up look at me. She stared at me through her hazel eyes. "Don't say you've actually forgotten me, Margot. I mean, surely I haven't changed all that much over the years.
Heavens, I think it's been about 15 or 16 years since I saw you last. I might have aged a wee bit, but I've spent a vast fortune, I'm not ashamed to say, to keep the face in tip-top shape, with a nip here and a tuck there, she chuckled.
Sorry, I said. I don't know how to say this to you, but you do look very familiar. But I just can't place you.
Let me give you a clue, said the woman teasingly. I used to live in this property when I was a girl. I'm glad to see you've restored the place to its former glory. Thank God. The place was begging for a facelift, but as could be predicted, my ever-penny-pinching mother never spent a bean on it. She always was a Scrooge like that. Couldn't bear to part with any of her money.
No, you're not. You're Amanda Tea-Tree. I wouldn't have recognised you for all the tea in China. You're so polished these days, so refined.
It's me, she said. It's me. I'm your Amanda.
But I don't understand. I thought you moved to Canada with your mother.
I did move to Canada, but I returned to the Bluegrass State. Very, very recently, I have to say. I'm now happily married to a man my mother hated with an absolute passion.
How is your mother? I asked. How's she doing these days?
She sighed with relief, as if she could breathe again, after having dived under the water for a long period of time. Oh, my mother! She died very suddenly. 10 years ago it was. The coroner found she had a very aggressive bladder cancer. They didn't see it coming, you know. None of us actually did. One day she was there. The next she was gone. It was that fast.
Goodness gracious me! I'm so sorry to hear that. I had absolutely no idea.
Don't be sorry, said Amanda. My mother died a very lonely woman. I never abandoned her. I was her daughter, but I resented her for a very long time. Do you remember how mean she was to me growing up? I could hear the resentment in Amanda's voice, welling up like a raging volcano. You have no idea, Margot, how utterly humiliating it was for me as a young girl to always be saddled with somebody else's cast-offs, to end up with second-hand stuff every Christmas. I would have understood if we were poor, of course, but my mother was rolling in money. She had no excuse to make us live as though we were paupers. It was nonsensical.
I do remember. It was unfortunate, I agreed.
And I mean, what did she do all that saving for? To add a few more zeros to her bank balance? Or for a rainy day? Said Amanda, rolling her eyes in exasperation. She's only gone and left her vast fortune to me. And since her death, I've been making up for lost time. Spend, 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 spend is my new motto. I've made absolutely certain that my daughter Emma here has everything her heart desires, she said proudly. I will deny Emma nothing. I will never do to her what my mother did to me. Never.
I'm sure she had some good qualities, your mother, I said, although in truth I couldn't actually think of any.
You're very sweet to say that, Margot, but you don't have to be nice about my mother. I know they say you should never speak ill of the dead, but the truth is once she died, I felt like a caged tiger that had suddenly been set free. It was the most liberating feeling of my entire life, knowing I could do whatever I wanted without my mother breathing down my neck like a dragon.
I had no idea it was that bad, I said. And your father, how is he?
Oh, incredibly happy. He said divorcing my mother was the best thing he ever did. He's remarried now, and I have 4 half-siblings, and we all get along favourably.
That's amazing, I said. I'm very happy for him, and you, of course. So tell me about your husband that your mother loves to hate. Well, loved to hate, rather. You said she didn't like him.
Well, I met him in Canada. I was attracted to dating him, simply because my mother couldn't stand the very sight of him. I loved riling her up the wrong way. She was practically begging me not to go out with the man. I didn't bring you up to go out with low lives like him, she said to me. He'd been in prison for 5 years, you see. That bothered my mother greatly. Of course, I found it rather intriguing.
I always did like the bad boys, didn't I? Nothing's really changed very much on that score, she said, giving me a cheeky wink. You're kidding? I asked, trying to maintain a nonchalant composure. Oh, it was absolutely nothing. Nothing very serious. He went down the wrong path, that's all. Got involved with stealing cars. But he'd never veer down that path again. He's a reformed character these days. A good boy, you could say. But sometimes there's a bad boy still inside him, she teased. But the wildness in him is reserved exclusively for me, she said, allowing a pink flush to wash over her face. So why did you come back here then? I asked. Most people, when they leave their hometown, they don't look back. Oh, I love Kentucky, Margot. You see, Margot, I cannot rewrite the life I lived with my mother on this farm. But what I can do is begin again and write my own story, not literally, of course, but you know exactly what I'm talking about. And I love this part of the world, so of course I wanted to come back here. It's as simple as that, really. Mammy, said Amanda's daughter impatiently, when is my riding lesson going to start? I can't wait here all day. In any moment, sweetheart. Me and your riding teacher, Margot, have a long history behind us. We were best friends, you see, when we were young. We're catching up for old time's sake. Margot's daughter rolled her eyes with irritation. But I want to ride a horsey, Mummy. I want to ride right now, and I don't want to wait a minute longer. Margot raised up her hand like a lollipop lady at a pedestrian crossing. Oh, don't be so rude, Emma. It's not polite to interrupt. I'm talking to my old friend here. And you, she asked me. What about you, Margot? Are you married? Do you have any children? All of the above, I said. I have a husband called Josh and a daughter who's 15 now. She's called Crystal. Oh, how lovely. I am so delighted for you, Margot. Mammy! Why won't you ever listen to me? I came here to ride a horsey, said Emma impatiently. Why don't you get my horse for me right now? It's boring waiting around for you to stop talking. When I saw Emma's face growing red with indignation, I knew at once that Amanda had done a full 180 in raising her daughter by giving her everything she could possibly want. It would seem her child had become a precocious brat. Amanda had more than made up for her mother's penny-pinching ways. She had gone to the other extreme, denying her daughter Emma nothing. And whatever way you looked at it, that was not a good thing. Over the next few months, Emma began to thoroughly enjoy her riding lessons with me. But the self-entitled, exasperating, tiresome girl was far from a pleasure to teach. She was naturally obnoxious if things didn't go her way, and she would have temper tantrums or hissy fits. But when she engaged in juvenile outbursts like this, I would tell her I would end the lesson immediately if she didn't behave. Suffice to say that seemed to toe her in line and anchor her capriciously belligerent mood. Granted, she had an admirable natural seat on a horse. I was impressed with how favourably her horse riding was progressing. I knew she would be able to enter horse riding competitions and win all kinds of rosettes in the future. But she was the kind of girl that never had enough of everything she wanted. She wanted it all, and then some. Emma had an unfortunate fixation on the most beloved horse in our stable block, a black and bay American quarter horse called Glenn Freyer, who belonged to my daughter Crystal. I want to ride Glenn Freyer, she had insisted from the very first day she laid eyes on the horse. As for Emma, she was completely smitten with Glenn Freyer, and I knew that her obsession with the horse was not an auspicious start. I'm very sorry, Emma, but Glenn Freyer belongs to my daughter. You can't ride her without my daughter's permission. Emma stamped her feet impetuously. But I want to ride Glenn Freyer. I don't want to ride any other horse. It has to be Glenn Freyer that I ride. My daughter gave her free rein to ride Glenn Freyer during her lessons. Crystal was very unselfish in that regard, and was happy to appease the wilful, insubordinate child. Me and my daughter Crystal encountered Glenn Freyer quite by chance when we were riding our bicycles past a meadow one day on a country road not far from home. The young horse in the pasture trotted over to us, and for my 10-year-old daughter Crystal, it had been love at first sight. She threw her bicycle onto the side of the embankment and rushed over to the fence and stroked the horse lovingly, and I saw at once there was a connection with my daughter and the horse, like two magnets that are drawn together. The horse was incredibly affectionate towards us, nuzzling my daughter. Crystal's face lit up like a Christmas tree. "Oh, I love her! She's the most beautiful horse I've ever seen in my entire life. Oh, Mum, please can I have her?" I looked at my daughter incredulously. "Crystal, the horse is not for sale. It belongs to someone else. Surely you can understand that? You can't possibly want something that does not belong to you. That's not the way it works. We have lovely horses back at home you can ride." My daughter's face dropped. "But I don't want any other horse. I really want her. Can't you see, Mum? There's something special between the two of us." I could not deny that there was a remarkable, unfathomable connection between my daughter and this majestic-looking horse, a chemistry that was confounding, as if my daughter and this horse had known each other in another lifetime, as if there was a deep, stirring, soul-like engagement between the two of them. You would have to have seen it to understand what I'm talking about. I would have loved nothing better than to have purchased it for her, as Crystal was a very undemanding, unspoilt child that had never ever asked me for anything until now. By all accounts, I knew such a purchase was unlikely to ever happen. If I'd owned the stunning horse myself, I would never have chosen to sell it. It was a fine specimen, and although the other horses were healthy and in remarkably good condition, with glossy coats that gleamed like polished mahogany, and bright eyes, there was something spectacularly unique and individualistic about Glenn Freyer that made her stand out like a diamond in the rough above all the other horses in the field, a rare treasure that comes along once in a lifetime if you're very lucky. I have never seen such an easy-going, carefree nature in a horse before. She was the kind of horse that if human would have been described as going with the harmonious natural flow and rhythm of life, never allowing anything to get her down, or to deplete her inbuilt joyful ebullience, always perceiving that the cup was full to overflowing, the sort of horse that breezed into your life with the effervescent optimism of a rainbow after the rain on a sunny day. Little did I know that my daughter clandestinely rode her bicycle every morning when she got the chance to visit the horse in the meadow, bringing with her a plethora of apples for her favourite friend, and the two of them had become very attached to each other, with an unbreakable bond. "We will be together soon, I promise you," my daughter would tell the horse, who seemed to be remarkably reassured by her confident conviction, as if the horse comprehended every word that Crystal was saying. My daughter was a resolutely determined young girl. I had no idea the length she would go to get a horse that had stolen her heart. One day a mysterious woman rolled up our drive in her British racing green Land Rover Discovery. I was at home in the kitchen at the time, preparing my much-needed cup of morning coffee, when I watched a lady with a very straight deportment climb out of her truck very elegantly, with the grace of a Lipizzaner pony. She was a woman in her late 50s, early 60s, who looked as if horses dominated her entire life. I could recognize the familiar look, even though there was nothing she was wearing to suggest she was a rider. I possibly own a similar appearance to her, with slightly sun-kissed skin and tousled, messy hair that looks like the wind has lended a hand in adding volume to its many layers. I opened the door to the lady, who was wearing a white cotton pair of slacks that flared widely at the bottom, and a matching white flowing top. There was nothing tight or constricted about this woman. I imagine she liked to stretch her legs as much as her horses did. Women like her were as free-spirited as the wind, and as the horses they actually rode. "Hello there," said the woman in a crisp, articulate voice that made her appear extremely well-bred, polished and refined, like one of her thoroughbred horses I suspected that she owned. "May I come in for a moment, just for a quick chat?" I guided the woman into the kitchen, beckoning for her to sit down at one of my leather bar stools, at the pristine marble island. "Coffee?" I asked her.
"Now you're speaking my language," she said, giving me a warm smile.
I poured her a coffee in a large, generous-sized mug and handed it over to her.
"Excuse my manners," she said. "I do apologize. My name is Daphne Delura. I live in the farmhouse down the road from you, called Baytree Heights. I'm sure you know the place. You can't actually miss it."
I nodded. "Actually, I do know the place. Me and my daughter have passed your large meadow from time to time, riding our bicycles or horses. I must confess, you own magnificent-looking horses in that field of yours. My daughter's, let's just say, rather enamoured by one of them in the field, a beautiful black and bay mare with the sweetest nature you've ever seen."
"That's what I'm here about, actually. Do you have a daughter called Crystal, by any chance?"
"I do," I said, looking at her nonplussed. "You know my daughter?"
No, I don't at all, but I did receive this from her," she said, fiddling in her large leather purse to pull out a folded piece of paper. She handed it over to me. "Your daughter popped it into my letterbox a few days ago."
I stared in bemusement at the note, written in my daughter's handwriting. It read,
"To the owner of Baytree Heights, my name is Crystal. I'm 10 years old, and I live at Highlands Peak. My mother owns several horses and gives horse riding lessons. I pass your horses in the field very often. I like to visit the horse with the white heart in the middle of her head. I'm sure you know the horse I'm talking about. I call her Glenn Freyer. I'm not sure why, but it seems to suit her, although my mum thinks it's a boy's name. My mum said you'll never want to sell Glenn Freyer. She's a very special horse, but I love her so very much. I promise you I would give her a very good home. I know how to care for horses, you see. If you do ever consider selling Glenn Freyer, please will you let my mother know. She will be able to pay you the full price for the horse. My piggy bank is out of funds, you see, at the moment, because I've spent the money on apples for Glenn Freyer. My mummy would be very cross if she knew I did that, so please don't tell her my secret. With many thanks, Crystal."
"Oh dear," I apologised. "I am so sorry. I told my daughter that your horses were not for sale. I can't believe she went behind my back like this to approach you for your horse. It was very presumptuous of her to do such an outrageous thing. I'll be having words with her about this, you can be assured of that. And as for feeding your horses, I do apologise."
"Oh, please don't apologise," said Daphne. "I was quite charmed, actually, by your daughter's letter. If you must know, her boldness to contact me like this, well, it takes guts to do what she did. She must really love Glenn Freyer. And spending all her pocket money on apples for the horse is terribly sweet. Now, the reason I'm here is I was a 10-year-old girl myself once, in a very similar predicament to your daughter's. I was so passionate about one of my uncle's horses, and he saw how much that little horse meant to me. I begged my parents at the time to buy me the horse from my uncle, but they point-blank refused. I do remember my heart was broken into shreds, but my uncle gave me that horse Skylark. He knew how much Skylark meant to me. I asked him after he'd given me the horse what I could possibly do to thank him enough. And you know what he said to me? "One day, when you're in a similar position, and a child wants a horse from you, give it to her or him. That way you will be paying me back in full." Of course, so much time has passed since then. I'd completely forgotten that promise I made to him, until your daughter's letter serendipitously arrived on my doorstep. The memory came flooding back, almost as if my uncle was poking me from beyond the grave and saying, "Remember your promise to me. You need to pay your debt forward." "What exactly are you saying?" I asked her. "What I'm saying is that it is my absolute pleasure and great honour to give your daughter Crystal the horse she likes to call Glenn Freyer. It is a very special horse for a very special young lady." "How much do you want for the horse?" I asked her. Daphne raised her hand in objection. "Did I say anything about money? Absolutely not. If your daughter ever wants to pay me back for the horse in the future, when she's an adult and she meets a young girl asking for a special favour when she's older, like a horse or a dog or something like that, she should give it freely, just like my uncle did and like I'm doing today." "Wow, I don't know what to say," I said. Daphne laughed. "Some things are just meant to be, aren't they? They're just written in the stars. I really believe that. Probably before we were ever born. Anyway, I unequivocally believe that I was meant to own Skylark. That horse changed my life, as I am quite sure Glenn Freyer will change your daughter's life. I do believe every animal we ever own was not placed in our lives by random accident." "Well, when you put it like that, Daphne, I can't argue with you, can I?" I'd said. "I don't know what to say in regards to your generous kindness. You've made my daughter's dreams come true, and for that I can't thank you enough." So there we are. That's the end of part 1. Part 2 is tomorrow night, and it's very exciting, so don't forget to tune in. And that's when we have our Bigfoot encounter. So until next time, goodbye and good night.